All right, back to Bergson and the holographic theory of mind. Ongoing series. This will be part 31 on language comprehension, major problem. So we'll be looking a little bit at machine comprehension, a la Siri, Alexa, that is AI approaches. And then the few theories there are of human speech perception, that is how humans actually do it. And then what's in fact the current impasse, namely no one quite knows how humans do speech perception, comprehend language. This will lead us to Bergson's, as quite usual, buried model of language perception and understanding, buried in Matter and Memory in 1896, and thus to the concept of active memory, the missing ingredient, one of the missing ingredients in this entire subject, unexplored in today's conversation at all. Then to the concept of the virtual. There's a collapse, so to speak, in a dimension, and then to anatomical questions surrounding this, that is, the possible areas in the brain sensitive to this dimension, an inner ear, say, an inner eye, so to speak, and ultimately then to the complexity involved in this entire subject. So we're going to look at Bergson's model of language comprehension. I know I kind of left off with a quote in the last one with Chomsky. This interesting question whether the function and evolution of the human mentality can be accommodated within the framework of physical explanation as presently conceived. And indeed we'll be exploring this as we go. To set the stage, there's no current actual settled understanding of human language understanding, as there is none for perception, thus for memory, since we don't know what's really being stored. So too then, for language, which is dependent upon both perception and memory, this is going to be no better. The machine and AI efforts like Siri, Alexa, are not even attempting to replicate what humans do. So actually, there's a kind of massive explanatory gap going on. How do humans do it? Where does Bergson's model fit in his overall pursuit? Well, remember his main question. Is experience stored in the brain? This was the focus of Matter and Memory, and the focus of his previous years of research. The answer absolutely determines our theory of consciousness. No one today understands the significance of this question. No one poses it, no one considers it. Not Searle, not Chalmers, not Dennett, not Bloch, not, well, most anyone. But if you have no memory model for the simplest events, be it coffee stirring, be it flies buzzing by, you have no theory of consciousness. If your memory model for a simple thing like coffee stirring is to disassemble that ongoing event into features and store the features instant by instant and reassemble the features instant by instant in real time, no definition of the features, no principled definition of features or of instance or of how to disassemble and reassemble these, you've got a huge problem. That's just for starters on the significance of memory and consciousness. So he was researching memory losses, aphasias, amnesias. One class of these, the loss of the ability to understand language. Sometimes the loss of individual words or classes of words. Does this imply words are stored in the brain? To answer this, he had to build a model of language understanding. Not in great detail, but sufficient to address the storage question. And of course, yes. It's totally buried. In Matter and Memory, one would not know that Bergson had, and today, had developed a model of speech perception. So it's not detailed, but within his overall holographic framework, and therefore a challenge to the current mindset and the gap. Now, caveat. I'm far from an expert on speech perception. At graduate school at the University of Minnesota, Center for Human Learning in the 1970s, many folks were heavily into speech perception, as a certain stance about it is very related to Gibson's theory. It's closely related to names like Carol Fowler, Donald Schenkweiler, Randy Deal, who was at U of M, and others. It was a subject too vast, complicated to try to pursue along with everything else. So no claims here with respect to vast knowledge. So the speech perception problem. Here it is. How do listeners extract the most fundamental linguistic elements, consonants and vowels, or the distinctive features which compose consonants and vowels from the acoustic signal? So let's quickly see why we can set aside machine approaches. As noted, no attempt is being made to do it like humans, and we'll understand the why this shortly. So in the 1950s, computer efforts began already at Bell Labs, a system for single speaker digit recognition, that is spoken digits, like the word 7. They were limited in the 50s to single speaker systems, that is, the robot couldn't recognize the same word 7 spoken by different speakers. He was trained for one speaker and around 10 words. It worked by locating the formants in the power spectrum of each utterance. So what are formants? Well, a formant is the spectral peaks of the sound spectrum, or in phonetics, the acoustic resonance of the vocal tract. So a resonance, or the spectral maximum that the resonance produces, is measured as amplitude peaks in the frequency spectrum of the sound using a spectrogram. So in the picture above, we see the three vowels A, O, U, and the frequency signatures of those vowels, shall we say, and there we see for each vowel two formants, F1 and F2, at different locations in that frequency spectrum, shall we say. So that's what a formant is. In 1970s, James and Janet Baker came up with the hidden Markov model. This is a statistical technique for, shall we say, predictions. It combines different sources of knowledge, acoustics, language, syntax, in a probabilistic model. So already the veer is taking place toward statistical modeling, away from emulating the human brain. Note too, though, that already they're veering also away from simple analysis of the speech stream and bringing in much more stuff, much more knowledge, language, syntax, probably some semantics, etc. The linguist thought that hidden Markov models were way too simple to capture language. They were not happy with this. But in the 1980s, the hidden Markov models were dominant. Heck with the linguists. In the 2000s, deep learning, particularly the LSTM or long short-term memory flavor of recurrent networks, RNNs, have taken over. And from our deep learning part 23 one, we can have our old picture up there of recurrent network. Notice the idea that they're feeding in yesterday's predictions up there on the right, and today's input. In other words, they're saving past information, feeding in with current information to make a prediction as to what, say, a stock price will be for today. And the LSTM down in the bottom half there is even more complex, but again, involves saving old information, feeding it back in with current information. So LSTMs handle cases requiring memories of events that happened, in this case, thousands of discrete time steps ago, which is important for speech. So we're going much further back into the past events than just yesterday's prediction. Why? why did this happen? Because of the advent of big training data, remember, Google Images, Wikipedia text, and big computing power. This greatly increased accuracy over the hidden Markov models, 30% or more. Bottom line, AI guys now have little interest in how people do it. So what were and are the main theories about how people do speech perception, about which the AI guys don't care? To start with a little quote here from Randy Deal, formerly of my U of M alma mater. A complete explanation of how humans recognize consonants and vowels remains elusive. From a 2005 paper, and not much has changed. There are three main theories: the motor theory of speech perception, the direct realist theory, in line with Gibson, and the general learning approach, which Randy Deal, who sort of split off from the Gibsonians, advocates. The motor theory. This too started in the 1950s at Haskins Labs with Alvin Lieberman. It involved a series of landmark studies on the perception of synthetic speech sounds and the mapping between speech signals, that is the acoustics, and the linguistic units, phonemes, is very complex. In other words, you've got a complex phoneme or acoustic signal, and in this complex signal, somehow in there is vowels, consonants, for a word like understand. How do we get that mapping? Well, the conclusion already was that perceived phonemes and features have a simpler relationship to articulation, that is, our vocal tract movements, than to acoustics, the actual acoustics, the sound pattern, the frequencies pattern. That is a relationship that's more nearly one-to-one. So much better and simpler from the source of the production of the sound itself. Every version of the motor theory has claimed that the objects of speech perception are articulatory events rather than acoustic or auditory events, rather than just the sound. More specifically, it was hypothesized that the articulatory events covered by human listeners are neuromotor commands to the articulators, for example, to the tongue, lips, and vocal folds, rather than more peripheral events, such as actual articulatory movements or gestures. So one version of the motor theory actually moved to the neuromotor commands as opposed to the actual articulatory movements or gestures, quote unquote, where a gesture like moving your hands is seen as equivalent to a gesture like moving your vocal tract. The objects of speech perception must be more or less invariant with respect to phonemes or feature sets, and by a further belief that such a requirement was satisfied only by neuromotor commands. So let's look at these two Formant patterns, key in this whole subject. So on the right we have two syllables, D and do, perceived by listeners as syllables D and do. The steady state formants correspond to the target values of the I and the U. So the steady state formants are the horizontal lines here, the unchanging, shall we say, through time, frequency value. So D has two fairly separated steady state formants. Notice that the do has two rather closer steady state formants. So in this case, the rapidly changing formant frequencies or formant transitions at the onset of each syllable carry important information about the initial consonant. So again, let's take a look at the little note I've got there. The rising first formant transition of both syllables signals that the consonant is a voice stop, such as b, d, g. So first formant here, each one is rising. Rising first formant, significant of d. The rising second formant transition of d and the falling second formant transition of do provide critical information about the place of articulation. So again, D has a rising formant transition in the second formant, but do has a falling formant transition. And the question is, how does so different an F2 transition give rise to the same phonemic percept? And this suggested that invariance must be sought at an articulatory rather than an acoustic level of description. That is, the perception of D must come from the fact that it's being produced invariantly by the same method, by the same modulation of the vocal tract. Here's some other pictures, bigger pictures of the formant transitions. If you notice, going down the columns, we're talking about one vowel here, or I or E. Here's the B, E. We're talking three different consonants, B, D, and G. So the point being, like, for example, the U sound has the formants always in this very close, fairly close proximity. The O is even closer, but they're both in this, but they're always in the same spot for the O. The E, same place. So they across the sound. So the steady state F1 and F2 patterns determine the vowel reading over here. And the formant transitions constitute context-sensitive cues to place or to the place of the articulation of the stop, the g, the b, the d. The question is there a common property that defines a given place of articulation in terms of formant transitions? And there pretty much is. Again, notice in this little picture, we've got the different vowels, I through U, and what we're seeing is that the formant transitions are always pointing back to a common spot. When we're talking again, we're talking about the preceding consonant being D. So as long as the preceding consonant is D, then these transitions, even though some are rising and some are falling, are pointing to this common locus of roughly 1.8 kilohertz. So this is again, the information seeming to point to a common point of articulation or method of articulation. Then if we simply go back for a second to the whole problem, the bigger looking problem of the speech stream, just to get a picture of it, here we have a little statement, Roy read the will, and here's the spectrogram of that statement, Roy read the will, and out of that, we're tasked with picking up the formant transitions such that we can identify vowels, consonants, ultimately syllables in that speech stream. Now there's another theory, the other competing theory, one of the direct realist theory. This was developed in the 1980s by Carol Fowler at Haskins Laboratory also, same place that Lieberman came from. Direct realist theory asserts that the articulatory objects of perception are actual, phonetically structured vocal tract movements or gestures. That is, we're actually perceiving the vocal tract movements or these gestures not events that are causally antecedent to these movements. For example, we're not picking up neuromotor commands. This direct realist theory also contrasts sharply with motor theory in denying that specialized, that is, speech-specific or human-specific mechanisms play a role in speech perception. Following Gibson, Fowler argues that speech perception can be broadly characterized in the same terms as, for example, visual perception of a surface layout, remembering that texture density gradient with its mathematical relations of those texture elements, or the flow field, all carry information for specifying the nature of that layout, how fast we're moving, etc. So Fowler's arguing that speech perception is broadly characterized in the same terms as this visual case. As she says, animals use structure in the media, it is in the light in this case, or the sound, that has been lawfully caused by events in the environment as information for the events. Even though it is the structure in the media, that is light for vision, skin for touch, air for healing, that sense organs transduce, it is not the structure in those media that animals perceive, otherwise we just don't see light. Rather, essentially, for their survival, they perceive the components of their niche that cause the structure. That is, whether it be a beach-like surface, the gravel structure of a driveway, or the rate at which we're flowing toward the mountains in the sun there. We're seeing the components of the environment that cause the structure in the light or in the sound. Gibsonian stance. The term indirect realism is meant to imply that perception is not mediated by processes of inference or hypothesis testing. Like in the visual world, the perception is direct in that we're seeing directly the external world where it says it is, as given by the information in the texture density gradients or the flow fields, etc. So rather, the information in the acoustic signal is assumed to be rich enough, just like the flow fields, texture gradients, to specify, that is, determine uniquely the gestures that structure the signal. That is, the vocal tract gestures, just like a gesture of waving your hands. A talker's gestures, for example, the closing and opening of the lips during the reduction of pa, structure the acoustic signal, which then serves as the informational medium for the listener to recover the gestures. Again, to perceive how the speech, the gestures, are being made at the point of the speaker. To perceive the gestures, it is sufficient for the listener simply to detect the relevant information. That D and do are perceived as having the same initial consonant despite their disparate F2 transitions, as we saw, one rising, one falling. Both the motor theory and direct realism theory see this in terms of an assumed commonality of gestures in the two cases. So by now it's kind of clear why the AI folks don't care how humans do it. For either motor theory or direct realist theory, well, a robot must have the human vocal apparatus, give him his eye back too, or at least the physical understanding thereof. That is, the robot would have to understand the dynamics, the forces that are involved in modulating that vocal tract, and of course the vocal tract itself and all the various pieces of forces acting on it to understand or to do what the direct realist theory and motor theory are asking for. Now, the general learning approach, the third of the approaches, is with Randy Deal, It's almost more of a reaction to findings appearing to contradict motor theory and direct realist theory than a well-specified theory. Deal's own conclusion is such. Therefore, a major challenge for the general learning approach is to develop hypotheses based on far more accurate information about the auditory representation of speech and the statistical properties of natural speech. In other words, he's admitting that there's a long way to go to well formulate this general approach. But the approach does not invoke special mechanisms or modules like motor theory with its neurotransmitter or the neural commands that it needed to explain speech perception. It assumes speech sounds are perceived using the same mechanisms of audition and perceptual learning that have evolved in humans to handle other classes of environmental sounds. Speech perception is neither equivalent to nor mediated by the perception of vocal gestures. So it's arguing against the idea that we're perceiving vocal gestures or the sources and means of articulation. So the problems that they note. Well, birds, as opposed to humans, have been trained to discriminate D versus do. So Flora there could discriminate, I do want a worm, or do not dismiss Bergson. Well, kind of. The apparent implication, having the human vocal apparatus is not all that important. Robot likes that. There are other phenomena also to include categorical perception, which we won't go into, and several phonetic context effects. The point being, the argument is these are not unique to speech or to human listeners. So taking a shot at the idea that we need to perceive the gestures of the vocal tract. Again, the general theory asks, can the sound stream actually precisely specify its source, as per direct realist theory? That is the information actually within the sound stream necessary to precisely specify how the human vocal tract is moving? So in the optical case, organisms with 2 or 3 types of cone photopigments, given the spectral distribution of reflected light, this cannot be unambiguously recovered because every pattern of cone responses in those cones is compatible with an infinite set of hypothetical surface reflectances. So the information is not unambiguous. The layout of surfaces, however, such as our texture gradient, specifying the nature of that surface, however, is accessible. Or the slant of that surface, though the slant requires motion to disambiguate the slant. But there must be information available to the perceiver that uniquely specifies that property. So in the case of slant, you need more than just a gradient. You need the motion of the gradient, motion across the gradient. In the acoustic case, there are many different ways to produce a different speech signal. Approximately the same formant pattern can be achieved either by rounding the lips, lowering the larynx, or doing a little of both. And there's been mathematical proofs provided that quite different drum shapes can produce the same sound. So again, calling the question whether the information in the acoustic stream is actually sufficient to precisely specify the vocal tract, the source of the sound in the movement of the vocal tract. So the inverse problem, that is mapping speech signals onto vocal tract shapes that produce them, given there's multiple vocal tracts that produce the same possible sound, would have to be solved. So enter Bergson. Well, 122 years ago. So with respect to human perception, For the basic elements of speech, consonants, vowels, there appears to be an impasse. No one knows how it's done. In my humble opinion, they're kind of dead in the water. Now, yes, caution, motor theorists, direct realist folks would certainly not say dead in the water. For example, Fowler authored a vigorous defense of direct realist theory in 2017. But the general approach folks have clearly an interesting set of arguments. And it comes down to direct realist theory definitely having an inverse problem. They have a unique specification problem. And in essence, motor theory pretty much shares the same problem, given that different sets of motor commands could produce the same sound, different sets of neuromotor commands. Now, this is a schema we've been implicitly indulging this whole time. That is, we have, as Bergson would say, an indivisible process broken into discrete stages, analytically, and discrete elements. But this is not the reality. That is, we have the acoustic stream, a continuous stream, and the attempt is being made to break this into individual elements, vowels, consonants, from which we will then build syllables, and then words, then sentences, and then ultimately the idea or the meaning. But we're failing, we're not getting there. This buildup is not working since we're not getting the precise specification of those original elements, of those discrete elements. Now, one could have seen this in the 1970s if your head happened to be buried in Bergson. But one would also have seen that no one was really ready to consider him at that time, not given the momentum of the computer model of mind, for one thing. And not that this is going to be easy now either. As we've seen over the last 30 parts or so, this is a conception that's difficult to sell because it's such a revolutionary framework. But we're about to see something familiar, but in a much larger context. As noted, Bergson's analysis began in the context of memory losses, aphasias, loss of understanding of language, words, specific words, classes of words. He had to set a basis in the very nature of language comprehension. So he began his analysis as though we were in a restaurant in France and we didn't understand the language. I listened to two people talking in a language that is unknown to me. The vibrations that reach my ears are the same as those that strike theirs. Yet, I perceive only a confused noise in which all sounds are alike. In this sonorous mass, however, the two interlocutors I'm listening to distinguish consonants, vowels, and syllables, which are not at all alike. In short, separate words. Between them and me, where is the difference? This is the question. Quote, how can the knowledge of a language, which is only memory, modify the material content of a present perception and cause some listeners to hear what others in the same physical conditions do not hear? Now think about this question. You do not see this question asked by the direct realist or the motor theorist or the general approach theorist. Look at it again. How can the knowledge of a language which is only memory modify the material content of a present perception? That's the question. So shades of what we've just been reviewing vis-a-vis motor theory and direct realist theory. We can get there, he says, quote, if auditory impressions organize nascent movements, capable of scanning the phrase which is heard and of emphasizing its main articulations. Note, main articulations. Bergson does not want or need or think possible absolute precision of consonant vowel identification. We shall see why. But again, he does not need unique, precise specification. He's not trying to solve in a complete solution the inverse problem. So he goes on, these automatic movements of internal accompaniment, at first undecided or uncoordinated, might become more precise by repetition. They would end by sketching a simplified figure in which the listener would find in their main lines and principal directions the very movements, that is, the vocal gestures, of the speaker. And this would unfold itself in consciousness under the form of nascent muscular sensations, the motor diagram, as it were, of the speech we hear. So to adopt our hearing to a new language, to quote Bergson, would consist, at the outset, neither in modifying the crude sound nor in supplementing the sounds with memories. It would be to coordinate the motor tendencies of the muscular apparatus of the voice to the impressions of the ear. It would be to perfect the motor accompaniment. Now we shall see again something familiar, the dynamic scheme, the principle of his 1924 Revue Philosophique article, sketched out here in 1896. Sketched, but the implications for acting, not the fully developed ones we see in the 1924 piece. But already we'll see the sketch. To quote, in learning a physical exercise, a dance, a tennis serve, we begin by imitating the movement as a whole. As our eyes see from without, our perception is confused. Therefore will be the movement whereby we try to repeat it. But whereas our perception was of a continuous whole, the movement whereby we endeavor to reconstruct the image is compound and made up of a multitude of muscular contractions and tensions. Continuing, the confused movement which copies the image is then already its virtual decomposition. It bears within itself, so to speak, its own analysis. The progress which is brought about by repetition and practice consists merely in unfolding what was previously wrapped up and bestowing on one of the elementary movements that autonomy, which ensures precision, without, however, breaking up the solidarity with the others, without which it is useless. The true effect of repetition is to decompose and recompose, and thus appeal to the intelligence of the body. So the diagram is not internal speech, simply repeating words in one's head. Clinical facts show this. Motor aphasics who cannot pronounce words can still understand. This is because the diagram, by means of which we divide up speech, indicates only its salient outlines. It is to speech itself what the rough sketch is to the finished picture. Then, distinguishing between production and comprehension, he says, for it is one thing to understand a difficult movement, another to be able to carry it out. In other words, to comprehend is one thing, to produce another. To understand it, we need only to realize what is essential, just enough to distinguish it from all other possible movements. But to be able to carry it out, we must have brought our body to understand it. And continuing, now the logic of the body, just in my note here, like computer programming, allows no tacit implications. That is, no undeclared assumptions, undeclared variables, left out pieces of logic. It demands that all the constituent parts of the movement be set forth one by one and put together again. Here a complete analysis is necessary. The diagram is but a sketch. So how can such an accompaniment be produced? To effectively pronounce a word, Bergson notes, we know the tongue and lips must articulate. The larynx must be brought into play for phonation. The muscles of the chest must produce an expiration of air. So again, various components, like components of the dance, that have to be brought into play to make a word. So for every syllable uttered, a number of mechanisms already prepared in the cerebral and bulbar centers. These mechanisms join to the highest centers of the cortex via the pyramidal cells. Then he says, to quote, along this path, the impulse of the will travels. So when we desire to articulate this or that sound, we transmit the order to act to this or that group of motor mechanisms selected from them all. So a little note here, given the just preceding discussion with respect to dynamic schemes, like coordinating the components, the various actions, muscular movements of a dance, so pronouncing any word would also involve a dynamic scheme. Now, this is going to add complexity down the road. As you imagine producing a sentence, then all the, shall we say, mini dynamic schemes involved in pronouncing all these words. So, especially complexity when considering the production of a sentence. Certain aphasic phenomena show these mechanisms underlying the motor diagram are related to the perception of speech. In the case of Lichtheim, due to a fall, the subject had lost the memory of how to articulate words and thus could not speak spontaneously. Yet, he could repeat correctly what was said to him. Another Lichtheim case, where spontaneous speech is unaffected, but word deafness absolute. In other words, he could not understand words. The patient, not understanding what is said to him, he can still repeat what is said to him. And then there's echolalia. The subject repeats mechanically what he hears, as though auditory sensations convert automatically to articulations. To quote Bergson, all these testify to a tendency of verbal auditory impressions to prolong themselves in movements of articulation, a tendency which surely does not escape, as a rule, the control of the will and expresses itself by an internal repetition of the striking features of the words that are heard. Now, our motor diagram is nothing else. Another case, the patient had retained both the auditory memory of words and the sense of hearing, but could not understand, or could understand nothing said to him. Remember, the crude auditory perception is really the continuity of sound, that massive frequency fluctuations we see in the spectrogram. The diagram, the sensory motor connections established by habit, break up this continuity. So he hears the sound, but again, it's just the babble buzz, back to the case of being in the French restaurant. In addition to these, thus to the supporting apparatus for the diagram, hinders the decomposition of the sounds and would check the upsurge of verbal memories, which alight on the perception, to use Bergson's phrase. Cases indicative of this motor diagram damage: Adler, in word deafness, the patients no longer react to even the loudest sounds. The sound no longer has its motor echo. More cases. A patient of Charcot with temporary word deafness heard his clock strike, but could not count the strokes. Likely, he could not separate and distinguish them. Another patient perceives the words of a conversation as a confused noise in the babble buzz. Another patient can't understand spoken words, but recovers if the word is repeated slowly, several times with marked divisions, syllable by syllable. So all these are cases that Bergson goes through. Again, all these facts combine to prove the existence of a motor tendency to separate sounds and establish their diagram. So let's take a brief stop at vision. Let's take the motor accompaniment in this context of vision. We're all familiar with the experience of moving into a new city and experiencing the initial lack of a feeling of familiarity or recognition with our environment. However, after time, we become quite familiar. And as Bergson argued, our body becomes automatically attuned to the environment. That is, we develop this motor accompaniment, automatic accompaniment. We and our body know exactly where we are, where to turn, where we are going, etc. Just like walking down your driveway. As you flow down the driveway, there's ultimately a feeling of familiarity, greater and greater familiarity. The feeling arises from the development over time, again, of an automatic motor or action system accompaniment to our perception. The street layouts, gradients, flow fields, building contours, all bring about an automatic organization of potential actions. So you have, for example, as you walk down the driveway, a flow field and a gradient, all of which are information which can be used to relate ultimately in the form of habit to the action systems. Again, say a certain lesion to the brain disrupts the mechanisms which create this schema of organized actions, this accompaniment. We have the phenomenon of a standard aphasia disorder. We look at the street and no longer recognize it, nor do we have the slightest idea which way to turn. But has the memory of the streets, the city, the normal habitat, the experiences been lost? Bergson pointed out a case described by Wilbrand. The patient could describe with her eyes shut, in imagination, the town she lived in, and in imagination walk through the streets. Yet once in the street, she felt like a complete stranger. She recognized nothing and could not find her way. So what is lost here? Again, that's certain action accompaniment or organization built over time relative to the perceived spatial layout. What is not lost? Interestingly, the memory image, the experience, the ability to integrate the experience. Again, we are surrounded by objects of our everyday experience, which are normally associated with certain sets of actions: spoons, forks, tables, chairs, bowls, hammers, etc., all of which we have used repeatedly over time. So what occurs when a lesion to the brain disrupts the mechanisms which organize the normal motor responses to such objects? There occurs the standard agnosia, the failure to recognize objects. Thus, a victim who was once a writer may be shown a pencil and have not the slightest recognition of its function. Yet the patient can summon a mental picture of the object name and describes it very well. These auto accompaniments are nowadays termed action syntogems. And these overt actions, a function of the action syntogem or accompaniment, are eventually inhibited. So there's inhibitory networks formed. But lesion the inhibitory networks, then you get another syndrome. You see a cup, but cannot help yourself from reaching for it to grasp it. You can't stop that normal reaction that's been learned. The inhibition structure is now gone. This automatic motor accompaniment has multiple components or processing phases. It's all very complex, some of which are related to perceptual analysis, some to the grouping of relations, and some ultimately to the relation of perception to action. A patient known as CK, described by Berman in 1994, received a severe trauma to the brain in an auto accident. He is very poor at recognizing visually presented objects. Yet he can name and recognize the same object presented to the touch. His visual recognition failures appear to stem from an inability to segment and group elements in an array. He cannot match or trace items that are overlapping. For example, those cups which are overlapping. And cannot segment a figure from the ground as visual noise is increased. So he might even have difficulty segmenting the plates from the background. He can pick up local features of an object, but not organize them as a whole. A dart is called a feather duster. A tennis racket is called a fencer's mask. CK copies geometric forms in a slavish, piecemeal fashion. without appreciating the identity of the object being copied. Yet despite the recognition deficit, his mental imagery, and thus his memory of images of object, is intact. He can draw wonderfully in detail from memory the very objects he cannot recognize, and describe in detail the size, color, and shape of the letters and objects he fails to identify visually. So again, we see this dissociation. Memories are retained, and yet apparently certain aspects of memory are completely gone. I'd note too that in the slavish piecemeal fashion in which he's copying, this relates directly to Piaget's discussion in The Child's Conception of Space, where he describes the development of the child's ability to reproduce a geometric form coherently. That is not the slavish piecemeal fashion. He describes it in terms of the development, again, this dynamic trajectory of mathematical group relations underlying the action of the drawing. That is, this is a complex ability that a lesion is affecting. Because here too, if you remember the aphasic who we talked about, who could not draw a room unless an X is drawn on the paper showing the aphasic's position. In other words, he did not have the fluid group dynamic ability to draw. So all this is part of Bergson's argument. The loss of certain memories, like what a pencil does not mean that experience is stored in the brain. So there is an automatic, a motor basis for visual recognition and for words. Destruction to this motor accompaniment does not mean memories or experiences are lost. Let me give one more quick example of the not lost. Bergson noted Ribot's observation that there are cases of word loss that proceed in this order, from proper nouns lost first, then nouns, and then verbs being lost last. But recovery of the words is in reverse order, for this also happens. Thus, verbs are brought back first, then nouns, then proper nouns. So firstly, there is the fact of yet another phenomenon where there is not actual memory loss at all to supposed memories, images of words being stored in the suitcase of the brain. But secondly, why this order? Bergson proposed this, that verbs imply or represent simple actions, and the body can most easily be moved into a motor attitude, in his terms, we'll see it again, to allow us to recover the word, that is, to redintegrate it. For example, if I simply can't remember the word dance, perhaps if I just try a little bit of simple dancing, I can bring back the word dance. This is part of the redintegration theory I set out in part 4, where the motor action are part of the invariant structure involved in an event. Now, nouns represent objects that are more complex, a nexus of sets of actions. For example, a piece of cheese, I can slice it, I can eat it, I can grate it, I can wrap it. So it's a complex set of actions. Harder to recover from that point of view as in terms of the word for that object. And then lastly, pronouns. Well, pronouns represent a person, an even more complex set of actions, plus context/environments where you find these people at work, home, versus the coffee shop, etc. So this, of course, is in totality, a look at memory, very bodily based in reality, that we're just not going to see in cognitive science today. And we'll see that again in a second. So again, there is an automatic motor basis for visual recognition in words, the automatic motor accompaniment. Underlying this, there is the implication that there are two forms of recognition, explicit acknowledgement of this in Bergson. So there's the automatic, that issuing from the motor accompaniment, the object with its action syntagems, all there, however suppressed normally by inhibitory networks. So this is a recognition arising from the object. And then there's the attentive form of recognition. That's relying on a complete circuit from the memory image to the actual perceived object, formed with active memory projecting memories. So this is from the subject, automatic from the object, attentive from the subject. Implicit here also, not that implicit in Bergson's discussion, is a model of conscious attention, a concept of what conscious attention actually is. So I note, as I kind of mentioned already, this elementary distinction, automatic versus attentive recognition, with this accompanying notion of familiarity, say of my driveway, being a function of an automatic accompaniment to the environment, to my knowledge is totally absent in cognitive science. Why? Well, look at the automatic recognition. It involves a bodily feeling. It's an intrinsic intentionality, but there's no room for this in the pure symbolic architecture approach and framework of cognitive science or AI. So you won't see any attempt to come to grips with the implications of Ribot, with bodily retrieval, so to speak, via a motor attitude of memories, or especially this particular distinction between automatic and attentive recognition. And note again the relation to explicit memory here and the problem of the symbolic. Again, I see the wind chimes on my porch, and instantly this wind chime set is impregnated, so to speak, with past memories of being a present for my life, for my wife. So they're symbolic in that point. The object is attentively recognized, permeated with memory, and symbolic. All this is a precursor to the second part of the language comprehension story. To quote, "These inner movements are like a prelude to voluntary attention. They mark the limit between the voluntary and the automatic. By them, the characteristic phenomena of intellectual recognition are first prepared. But what is this complete and fully conscious recognition?" Through the series, I've been portraying the four-dimensional extent of being as in essence static, just a trillion extension of our being in time as we press on into the future, present after present. But this extent is in actuality dynamic, active. One can ask, why should it not be active? It is all me. It is all our four-dimensional being. A small extent of time was active, for example, during an event such as we're stirring our coffee in the morning. But where is the dividing line when it becomes static? So Bergson introduces what I'm calling part 2 as such. We have said attentive recognition is a kind of circuit in which the external object yields to us deeper and deeper parts of itself, as our memory adopts a correspondingly higher degree of tension in order to project recollections towards it. So note above the concept of tension and active projection, and we shall have to explore this all in a bit. So Bergson says, in the particular case which we are now considering, the object is an interlocutor, as opposed to a coffee cup as an object, or as we shall see in the next slide, a tree stump. An interlocutor whose ideas develop in his consciousness into auditory representations which are then materialized and uttered as words. Continuing, so if we are right, the hearer places himself at once in the midst of the corresponding ideas and then develops them into acoustic memories which go out to overlay the sounds, the crude sounds perceived, that acoustic stream, while fitting themselves into the motor diagram or sketch. So we're placing ourselves in the idea of coffee stirring, and then letting that idea flow and break up into the words perceived. The man stirred the coffee with a spoon. Starting from, shall we say, the inner direction. Noting that to understand another's words is to reconstruct, starting from the ideas, the continuity of sound perceived, he says, and more generally, to attend, to recognize intellectually, may be summed up in a single operation whereby the mind, having chosen its level, having selected within itself, with reference to the crude perceptions, that is a sketch, the point that is exactly symmetrical with their more or less immediate cause, allows to flow towards them the memories which overlie them. So we've entered here again this problem of the syntactic unfoldment. And lastly, where the syntactic rules, the syntactic order and structures unfolded from S. And as we noted, we have no actual theory of S. For S is Lashley's atemporal or contemporal idea from which everything devolves. And so, for a reference point, in reality, this is what we're talking about. The S from which the syntactic structure of the sentence now evolves. There are simple examples of this projection. We hear a new song on the radio. The words are very hard to understand, to catch. Indistinct. We cheat. Someone tells us the words, or we find the text, or we just listen long enough over and over again. Now the words are heard clear as a bell. We're walking in the woods. Suddenly we see a bear along the trail. Creeping a bit closer, it's just a tree stump. The past memory was projected upon the perception. Bergson noted studies in reading, where it's shown that very few letters are actually seen as we read, but yet we're seeing the words. As he called it, it's a veritable process of divination. In recent years, this pretty much went under the subject or title of filling in, like the brain filling in the tile pattern on this wall, as though, however, the whole image is simply constructed by the brain. Now, this notion of filling in was used as a justification for indirect realism, that we're just generating the whole world. Dennett, for example, was very big on this filling in concept because it kind of goes with this whole notion that consciousness is just an illusion. Kind of. But Dennett's a little bit difficult to really piece together. Unfortunately, needed is the model of the image of the external world in the first place. Because you can't have images in memory to fill in unless you've already had some images. So, priority of the problem is an image of the external world in the first place. So, to quote Bergson, we start from the idea. We start from the idea, and we develop it into the auditory memory images capable of inserting themselves in the motor diagram. In other words, the motor diagram being a template, a sketch, so as to overlie the sounds we hear. But psychology is unwilling to go this way because, as Bergson said, of the invincible tendency which impels us to think on all occasions of things rather than of movements. We have a continuous movement. At no moment is it possible to say with precision that the idea or memory image or the sensation begins. And in fact, where is the dividing line between the confusion of sounds perceived, the acoustic stream in the lump, and the clearness which the remembered auditory images add to them? Or between the discontinuity of these remembered images, that is, the separate words, and the continuity of the original idea, which they dissociate and refract into distinct words. Rather, we get this. Again, this breakdown. where the continuity of sound is being attempted in a breakup to the consonants and vowels. This is the essence of the attempt by motive theory and direct realist theory. We have to perceive distinctly the consonant and vowels according to that theory. They're trying to explain the distinct starting point, the distinct breakup of this continuity of sound into these precise elements. And that's where their whole problem begins. Then we move from there to the words and then to the idea. And then as to the meaning. So, says Bergson, cognitive theory, he said psychology, erects the crude sounds heard into separate and complete words, and then the remembered auditory images into entities independent of the idea they develop. These three terms, crude perception, auditory image, and idea, are thus made into distinct wholes, of which each is supposed to be self-sufficing. So we, that is cognitive theory, see no harm in reversing the real order of the processes and asserting that we go from the perception to memories and from memories to the idea. Where the real order goes the other direction. With a little help from the motor diagram, we should say, initially. All the components of these stages are considered stored in various areas of the brain. A few pictures, for example, here we have stored memories going along the bottom, perceptual memory, visual knowledge, declarative knowledge, habits and skills. Nevertheless, we cannot help feeling that we must bring back again, under one form or another, the continuity we have broken. So, we go on materializing this continuous development itself, that is from, in reality, idea to perception, into lines of communication, contacts, and impulsions. And we kind of see that here with Barr's theory of consciousness. We see lots of lines going from unconscious verbal automations, unconscious items in immediate memory, unconscious visual spatial operations. But notice all the nice communications back and forth. Again, perception split up into tons of little things. Or another view of the same theory, lots of intercommunications. Nothing inherently wrong with this, unless we're forgetting what's actually going on. As he says, each new fact, each new lesion, each new malady will force us to complicate the diagram, to add new stations, centers, etc. Yet all these stations laid out side by side will never be able to reconstitute the movement itself. So remember, just again, in this context, the same principle as simply trying to explain the motion of the fly from A to B by a series of points, successively, temporarily occupied, so to speak, as the fly moves, discrete stages. Again, because between each pair of points, you have to use the same explanatory technique, a whole new set of points. And then between each pair of those points, another whole new set of points. Always between the points you have to explain the motion. Of course, this is an infinite regress. Same principle. Bergson noted the diagrams in his day were centers of visual memories, auditory memories, tactile memories. The centers multiplied. These maps are all eventually abandoned. Again, nevertheless, we still have them today, but they get vaguer and vaguer. He noted it's as though theorists never considered the structure of a sentence. They argue as if a sentence were comprised or composed of nouns, which call up images of things. What becomes of parts of speech? of which the precise function is to establish between images relations and shades of meaning of every kind. That is, to help express a dynamic event. So it's kind of curious today. You scan through a search like this, memory storage areas in the brain, just on Google Images, you won't really find anymore all that much actual labeled storage areas like visual memories, auditory memories, words, experiences, more likely rather involved in the storage of or important for the transfer into long-term memory or simple functions, like as we see to the right there, our little picture of the brain, that's just functions. Vision, memory, sensation, involved in language comprehension, motor and speech production, etc. Here you have where our memory is stored, and you'll have the motor cortex is involved in storing procedural memories, and the frontal lobe stores semantic and episodic memories. Now, that is quite a statement that they could never back up, because the frontal lobe is involved and important in explicit memory, but they could never show that memories are actually stored in the frontal lobe or where they would be. Prefrontal cortex involved in the storage of short-term memories, wherever that happens to be. There is no short-term storage area that they could point to. Again, the hippocampus, important in transferring memory into long short-term memory. Here we have memories being transferred to long-term memory, but where is that? Here we have long-term memory capacity is practically unlimited, but memories are not stored in a particular part of the brain. Rather, they are stored in many areas. And we've talked about this before, that an event like stirring has to be broken up into multiple components, elements, pieces, fragments, and somehow those multiple pieces are being drawn back again in real time to make the event, and also stored and reassembled. So you have a constant disassembling and reassembling, and then also that disassemble set is stored somewhere, but this is all very curious. Ultimately, we have, this could be storage areas, but I'm not sure because I can't read that. In truth, Bergson quite accurately described this state of affairs as a near fait accompli in 1896, and one could say forecasted the state we see today. That is another gorilla, where precisely our experience is stored, our words stored. There's pretty much silence on this. So he goes on, we are bound to consider what becomes of the known facts when we cease to regard the brain as a storehouse of memories. Bergson notes that every perception gives rise to a number of sensations, all coexisting and arranged in a certain order. In the case of an object, such as our cube on its gradient, the order comes from an organ of sense. The initial visual area, V1, which had not really been described in his time, would be this organ of sense for a visual object. This organ is like an immense keyboard, he argued, on which the external object executes at once its harmony of 1,000 notes, thus calling forth a definite order at a single moment, a great multitude of elementary sensations corresponding to all points of the sensory centers that are concerned. Suppress or remove the keyboard. The strings are still there, but there's nothing to activate them, to let 1,000 notes be struck at once. So the whole apparatus of strings behind that initial keyboard is still there, but we don't have the keyboard. We don't have, say, V1 or something, as we'll see, corresponding to it. In our opinion, the region of images, if it exists, can only be a keyboard of this nature, Certainly, it is in no way inconceivable that a purely psychical cause should directly set in action all the strings concerned. For hearing, he notes that the localization of this function appears certain. A certain definite injury of the temporal lobe destroys it. And given the many reasons for the impossibility of storage of images, he says, quote, hence only one plausible hypothesis remains, namely that this region, that is an area of the temporal lobe, occupies with regard to the center of hearing itself, that is physical hearing, that place that is exactly symmetrical with the organ of sense. It is, in this case, a mental ear. In essence, these initial keyboards may be activated from two directions. From without, via signals from the sense organs, that is, by a real object, and from within, through successive intermediaries, by a virtual object. So the auditory image, called back by memory, sets in motion the same neural elements as the original perception, that is, the elemental articulations comprising the motor diagram, in talking of speech. And the recollection must change gradually into perception. Thus, recalling to memory complex sounds or words can concern different aspects of the neural system as opposed to the mechanisms involved in the initial perceiving. So in psychic deafness, one can still hear physical sounds, the acoustic stream, but not hear the words, as the memory images cannot actualize. So, since we can't actualize the memories, we're back to buzz, buzz, babble. Strings are still there, and the influence of the external sounds vibrates still. It is the internal keyboard that is lacking. This, he knows, is a simplified picture. The various aphasic syndromes show that calling up an auditory image is not a single act. Between the intention, it is the pure memory, as he puts it, and the auditory memory images, there can be other memories realized as memory images in more or less distant centers. It is by successive degrees that the idea comes to embody itself in the verbal images per se. Again, note some of the sources of the complexity. One is the multimodal stirring event or idea itself, if we're talking of coffee stirring, with its invariant structure, part of the experience in 4D memory. The multiple individual word images, the man, stirred, coffee, spoon, the relations established, for example, a man doing the stirring, using, that is with, a spoon, the linguistic syntax, that structure of syntax. So, mental hearing depends on the integrity of various centers and paths. Whatever be the number of intervening processes, we do not go from the perception to the idea, but rather from the idea to the perception. The essential process of recognition is not centripetal, that is from without to within, but centrifugal. Shall we say from within to without? But this is the problem. The quote, here, indeed, the question arises how stimulation from within can give birth to sensations, either by its action on the cerebral cortex or other centers. But it's clear enough that we have here only a convenient way of expressing ourselves. However, subsequently, what he says is more of a recap, defining the nature of voluntary action. That is, as we saw in parts 9 and 26, we have the question of how we will to move and how images are involved in the simple act of reaching a coffee cup out to fill it up or bring it back to the mouth. These are voluntary action. And speech is simply another case of voluntary action. So speech and voluntary action are in reality very close to the same subjects. So he goes on, quote, pure memories, as they become actual, tend to bring about within the body all the corresponding sensations. But these virtual sensations, in order to become real, must tend to urge the body to action. The modifications in the center is called sensory. Modifications which usually precede movements accomplished or sketched out by the body. Again, remembering perception is equal to virtual action. These movements are less the real cause of the sensation than the mark of its power in the consolidation of its efficacy. And the progress by which the virtual image realizes itself is nothing less than a series of stages by which this image gradually obtains from the body useful actions or useful attitudes. That is, attitudes of the body toward possible action. So what have we seen? This model is far from non-problematic, far from simple. Yet keep in mind a few things. AR models are making no attempt to replicate human language perception. The current human models are, at least pretty much, dead in the water, precisely because they're attempting the impossible, the precise delineation and demarcation of separate events in that acoustic stream, that is, separate elements, discrete elements, vowels, consonants. And once you have an actual model of perception, the origin of the image of the external world, you have to follow its consequences. So let's go back a pace. Think on some aspects of this. So let's look first at Bergson versus motor theory and direct realist theory. Bergson's motor diagram looks to side with the motor theory, for you cannot construct such a diagram, even if only a sketch of vocal movements, without issuing neuromotor commands, no more than you could parse and construct the dance steps. That is, you can recreate the dance by trying to replicate the movements without issuing neuromotor commands. It seems inescapable. But he would equally agree with direct realist theory that there is acoustic information specifying the source of the sounds. We've seen that he would likely totally agree in the case of vision, that there is information that specifies external events of the world. But the sound information is likely insufficient for unique specification. He clearly already intuited this. Bergson's information is so only because related to the body's possible action. Remember, perception is virtual action. So Gibsonians, despite the notion of affordances, have never assimilated this. That's why you have Carol Fowler trying to purely specify the speech stream without any reference to neuromotor commands, as though that perception and virtual action were not a thing at all. So both motor theory and direct realist theory, and the general approach for that matter, are busily trying to show how parsed or identified in the stream, in the acoustic stream, are unique, discrete elements, vowels, consonants. For the intent is from these to do a bottom-up build. Take the syllables, consonants and vowels, make them into syllables, then into words, then into sentences, and then construct a meaning. For Bergson, this discrete starting point from these discrete elements, vowels and consonants, is a lost cause. You have only a sketch of sound production, probably somewhat ambiguous, almost certainly somewhat ambiguous in many cases. You need memory. Now the virtual. I've been showing images of events in 4D memory, such as my events of coffee stirring there. But this has been for illustrative purposes, so we can get the idea of events in memory. But for Bergson, this virtual extension, this pure memory, does not consist of images. So the images have to go. Images are a later stage, as pure memory is actualized in the dynamics of the brain. So hold on, we'll examine the meaning of this. The virtual extension, the 4D extent there, is in reality unextended. It's collapsed. We can conceive of this collapsed dimension in its entirety, as our entire past, as permeating the present 3D extended moment. That is permeating any event to include permeating the matter of the brain. So one will see critiques of Bergson and his image memory, for example, in Sartre and Piaget. But the problem is there is no image memory per se. This is an elementary misunderstanding of the virtual, or Bergson's pure memory. Image memory is only a dynamic process as the virtual actualizes. And the virtual is this unextended, permeating dimension throughout physical reality. So you have the virtual, which is pure memory, which is not an image or images, and which is unextended. It is driving into, shall we say, for want of a better term, affecting the brain, ultimately bringing about nascent or real action, only in this process becoming an image. This to me would mean the virtual is bringing about a resonant, reconstructive-like state of the brain, for example, specific to a past state or event in the field, be it coffee stirring, where the field is permeated by this unextended dimension of the past. Remember, perception is always already a specification of the past in the first place, a specification of a past extent of the transformation of the field. Now we would have once virtual events mixed in, driven by the active 4D pure memory that we are. Thus the auditory image, called back by memory, and as Bergson says, setting in motion the elemental articulations comprising the motor diagram, and the recollection changing gradually into perception. This would be, as just noted, a gradual specification of past images, your words within the 4D field. Then, as he discussed the complexity of recall operations, again quoting, there can be other memories realized as memory images in more or less distant centers. You can't actually quite mean this, for images cannot be in the brain. This is the whole hard problem. There is no photograph of the external world of the coffee cup in the brain. Neither can there be an image, a past image of the coffee cup in the brain. Again, we have to be conceiving of a form of specification of past events. Past events inwardly permeating the field, so to speak. And that is, the field itself has both an extended aspect, 3D, and an unextended aspect, the fourth dimension. As noted in earlier parts, we have to look at it as a psychophysical field. This being due to its indivisible transformation and to its holographic properties, which provides an elementary awareness in the first place. Very elementary form of awareness, indivisibly transforming. So the inner temporal lobe, the mental ear, what is it receiving? As we're dealing with something, an organ symmetric to the auditory, then it's receiving the virtual image of words. But something prior would have to be receiving the idea in its complexity and multimodality, i.e. the virtual image of coffee stirring, with its visual invariance, auditory or acoustic invariance, kinesthetic invariance. And then we have to ask, what is breaking this idea/event into the words? Man, stirred, coffee, spoon. The motor diagram is giving the outline or this breaking and filling, the goal. The words themselves, as part of the experiences of stirring, would be part of the image being received. That is, words as also an invariance across many events. When I'm stirring the coffee, my mom is saying to me, "You're stirring the coffee." Some mechanisms would have to pull them out towards the diagram of sounds. Trying to get a view of the complexity of moving from the idea into the perceived words. In visual perception, there is a chain from the eye to V1, from the retina to the lateral geniculate nucleus to V1 itself. And thus there's a pile of signals passing to V1. This has got to be equally so with respect to the ear and auditory perception. So likely a chain of mechanisms also to the inner keyboards, to inner V1, or to an inner temporal lobe. V1 is passing stuff, lots of information, to V2, V3, V4, etc. As we can already see in that diagram, going up the back of the brain, V1 going to V3, V6. The motor areas. It gets a wide group of mechanisms going. Again, another picture. All the information signals flowing to V4, V2, V3, etc. Another picture from V1 on the bottom to V2, V4 to the inferior temporal cortex on up. In this particular diagram, attempting to account for semantic properties like the word fish from the original perception of fish. So too, from the inner V1, there was as a whole pile of mechanisms going from inner V1 outward, yes, in Bergson's view. We see this implication in Chomsky's syntactic unfolding, or again, as we noted, its relation to Lashley in the atemporal idea. If S is actually the S from which these rules unfold, a dynamic event or idea, coffee stirring, then the initial transition to the first rewrite rule from this atemporal contemporal idea is still quite mysterious. It's absent in cognitive theory. We have to move from that idea of the dynamic event to the first rewrite, breaking it into a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and then all the subsequent rewrites to the sentence itself. The syntax expresses a learned way to break up or parse a dynamic event into phrases, words, and the accepted order syntax of the language. Some mechanisms have to be there to receive the idea and ultimately carry all this out, whether producing the sentence in the first place or simply hearing it, giving that, or projecting the idea towards the sound in the first place. I note there are other visions of syntax. I use this one as a simple visualization. Other visions more cognitively based than Chomsky's rule system framework expresses. But this is sufficient. As we saw, the syntax unfoldment is the dynamic scheme. The learning to produce the sounds of the language, the dynamic scheme. Like putting together the elementary motions in correct order that produce a dance step. This is now the dance scheme or dynamic scheme. Similarly, there's schemes one would suppose for say French words. We know how to form syllables, consonants, vowels. For English words, these gestures are a bit different for French. Interesting to speculate in the context of our discussion, the memory of spiders, of the gal sitting in the French restaurant for a couple months. The book again shown there, Megan McNeil Libby, and suddenly the babble of sounds becoming clear as a bell in French, all the meanings becoming clear. So has the motor diagram ability for French, the dynamic scheme, now been accessed? As a schema in the 4D field, like the spider does for web building? But there has to be more than this. There is the meaning of the words, the syntax of the language also. All has to be accessed then, or accessed, like our spider. Lastly, as noted in the previous part, it is the whole mind, the entirety of 4D being that is behind the understanding of a sentence. When a speaker says to me, the man paddled the canoe, the entirety of my experience of canoeing, multiple canoe trips, is being brought to bear. All that experience is driving toward that sentence and toward the schematic sounds of that sentence, the man paddled the canoe. Bergson noted, this active memory as a whole adopts various levels of tension relative to the sentence or the object. Again, as I read it, some of that applies to the amount of detail and fullness of meaning that's, shall we say, driven toward that event, the linguistic sounds. I noted earlier under LSD, this sentence, the man paddled the canoe, would bring reverberation after reverberation of meaning as it plumbed the depths of my experience. Yes, LSD has been shown very recently to be underlying the recruitment and communication of many more regions of the brain than in our normal state. And perhaps equally then, one could look at this as opening to vastly greater reception of and to past experience. So semi-conclusion, because it's hard to come with definitive conclusions here. Clearly, the more we try to think this out, the more obvious that Bergson only provided a 10,000-mile Google Earth view. Yes, or yet, it is the only theoretical attempt at a model of language comprehension given this, that it has a model of perception with an explanation of the image, the origin of the image of the external world, where this image, as a specification and experience, cannot be stored in the brain. Perhaps even the only language model that also respects the phenomena of aphasias, because I just haven't seen this discussed much. But as we've glimpsed, the complexity is enormous. The further conceptual breakthroughs needed, vast. Yes, we need Bergson back again. At the start, we noted this statement from Chomsky. It is an interesting question whether the functioning and evolution of the human mentality can be accommodated within the framework of physical explanation as presently conceived. The statement continued, we can, however, be fairly sure that there will be a physical explanation for the phenomena in question, if they can be explained at all, the phenomena being language, for an uninteresting terminological reason, namely that the concept of physical explanation will no doubt be extended to incorporate whatever is discovered in this domain, exactly as it was accommodated to include gravitational and electromagnetic force, massless particles, and numerous other entities that would have offended the common sense of earlier generations. I, for one, do not think it will be nearly as uninteresting, as merely terminological as Chomsky thinks. Bergson's temporal metaphysic, and especially if we combine this with the ether of Tesla, Maxwell Heaviside, Steinmetz, that is, the forgotten electromagnetism and all that has been unexplored there as of yet, implies an incredible, profound, and massive shift in our understanding of mind. That is the psychophysical, because that's, I think, where we're being led. a truly psychophysical understanding of the universe. And yes, then, of understanding. So we're not talking mere terminological. Massless particles, that's simply a cover for something that's not truly understood, a nice convenient concept to allow for computation. Gravitation is again simply a mathematics for something that is not understood. Electromagnetic force, as we discussed in 18 and 22, we're not even close to grasping all that's behind that. So I think we're gravitating toward a true understanding of the psychophysical universe. And lastly, everything we just viewed, really understanding in language that is on the symbolic, reminds us of the statement of Kassir. They believed that they had understood and explained an intellectual act if they could break it down into its simple components. And they held it to be evident or dogmatically certain that these components could consist in nothing other than simple sense impressions. But it was precisely this fundamental vision which inevitably removed them in theory from the peculiar principle and problem of the symbolic. And this is what we've been seeing in spades, in the one directional, from the bottom building all the way up to the idea. We've seen nothing but concatenation and juxtaposition of simple sense impressions until we come to the idea. And this entire mindset is what must be overthrown. So down the road, more on Bergson and current memory research, physics and its use of the holographic principle, question of time travel, access consciousness, quantum mechanics origin, and black body photoelectric effect, temporal consciousness, and as always, something else. So next time we'll see. Till then, signing off.